Hello and welcome to On Second Thought with Mike and Luke, an ongoing conversation about big ideas and current events. And we're exploring the connections and causes of our broken world, and we dig into what's really true and work to reshape the focus of our lives. Welcome to episode 10?
I don't think that counts the first two when we did a 0, a -1, and maybe a -2.
Yeah, I've sort of regretted that. So we worked on several episodes before we started, and then when we felt like, okay, we're ready, we wanted to have a little collection of episodes that we could put out all at once. And so the first one I put was 1, and then the other ones, chronologically, the way we had recorded them, were older.
Yeah.
So I named them episode 0 and -1. But
Yeah.
So we've done a dozen or so. Hey, so I have a question for you. I was pondering this question with my wife yesterday, driving up to Portland. Would you rather know everything or be able to learn everything? What's better, knowing or learning? I think I know what you'll say, but I'm curious.
Okay. Well, I'm going to say learning.
Right.
I don't think it's even it's an intriguing question, but it's really I think it's a pretty easy answer.
Yeah. Well, so here the second part is more interesting, I think. Okay. One is I've had this conversation with a few people in my life who got an immense amount of pleasure out of being right. And in my experience, it generally, when I've been that way, it's a hindrance to good relationship, right?
Yeah.
Okay. We assume or we believe that God knows everything, which then would tell us he doesn't learn anything.
Okay.
So why is that? Is that the separation between us and God? Why doesn't God learn things? Or maybe he does. So the verse about Abraham's asked to sacrifice Isaac, and then God intervenes, and God says, now I know that you won't hold back.
Yeah. I don't take that. I take that personally, that there's an anthropomorphic element in terms of God accommodating to humanity. If we think for a second about if you were to speak to an ant, okay?
Right.
And that's even a lesser bridge than God speaking to us.
Sure.
If you were to speak to an ant, you have to speak in the ant's language for the ant to understand something that you want it to understand.
Okay.
So you have to speak in its terms. Otherwise, it's meaningless. Just had this discussion with a friend who got upset with me, thinking that you can't have God communicating in an ancient language context because you don't think that's true. If we don't think that's true, if we think they're in air, God wouldn't speak in air. And I just think that's a mistake. He accommodates our language. So when he says, now I know, I think it's not a literal...
he's not learning about you. He knows about you.
That's for us. So, but I think the other question is good, actually, and I could take the other side that because I say it to learn is better because I'm finite, I'm person.
So let me extend it then to us. If we can't extend it to God,
no, I think
without being open theists.
Yeah.
But the question then is the joy of learning the joy of becoming more like God?
I think so. So I actually do think we can put it in God in this way, though. Just because he knows all things, that doesn't mean he doesn't grow in certain aspects. And what I think it means is that, and maybe this is accommodation too, but I think God delights in himself.
Okay.
And I get some of this, the initiation of these thoughts are really Piper's meditations, which I think he's made it a right insight. And I think it's in Scripture, he delights in his own self. He glories in his own self. He is pleased with his own excellence because it's perfection.
Good.
It's holy. And so joy is not a thing that is an accumulation. I have one measure of joy, and now I'm going to strive to get 2 measures of joy. Now I'm going to strive to get 3 measures of joy. It's not like knowledge where we're accumulating 0.1, 0.2, 0.3. We have joy that can expand and contract, having nothing to do with the accumulation of 0.1, 2, and 3. So a child can jump in a mud puddle that's been frozen overnight as he's walking to the school bus sign, and it cracks. And it's the coolest thing. and he just wants to do it again.
Yeah.
And his joy can even be more, and knows nothing more. His knowledge didn't increase, but his joy bounded even further.
So my mind jumps to our conversation last time about sorrow, and grief is connected to love, but also that maybe on the other end. So if grief is the loss of something you hoped for, right, or that something that you found joy in, and so joy itself is just enjoying or experiencing what is good.
Yeah,
right? Just
yeah.
goodness.
It's not necessarily getting something you didn't have before.
Unless that thing you got is good.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, and so for us as finite creatures, I think we're going to forever grow into learning about God. But he's infinite.
Yeah.
He knows all things, but the chief thing he knows is himself.
Right.
Because everything that we think is knowledgeable, he made.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not anything that I think. So in that sense, I think from a divine standpoint, to know all things, it's not an issue of better, because it's to delight in what you know.
Well, and what I imagine is God in the way that I enjoy teaching, not because I'm learning about the subject matter, but because I enjoy seeing the process of learning in the students. So I think of God as that,
Yeah.
experiencing that same joy.
I'm with you on that too, but I would say I do enjoy the topic. I like the beauty of what's true.
Even if you've already learned it.
Even if I've already
For
learned
sure,
it.
yeah.
Sometimes I like just thinking. I like rolling it around in my mind and looking at it and say, that is just so.
Well, and
cool.
I think the best teachers do that. So when I've gotten feedback as a teacher myself, the best feedback I feel like is not, wow, you really understood us, but rather, wow, you really love what you're teaching.
Yeah.
And that made us want to love it.
It thrills you.
Yeah.
And that comes through.
Yeah.
It's almost infectious. That is the best teachers.
Right.
They're excited about things.
All right, so we have this ongoing conversation. One of our ongoing topics is about church and how it should be, or maybe how it could be better. We try to do this without overly criticizing church, which is a pastime of many a Christian, right? As if only church was the way it should be.
There's a difference between critiquing and something you love that you want to be better.
Yeah, well, and I think of it too as someone who's a handyman, and I work on my home.
Yeah.
And I think, wow, what if I changed that thing? And now, like we did, I showed you, but we did this piece of trim above a doorway that had held one of those pull-up bars that like clicks in, but it was marring the trim, and the trim needed to be replaced anyway. So we built this hidden pull-up bar where the trim itself is like bolted heavy duty into the studs, and then it has a lip that you can't see at the top that we can click on pull-up bars on, and it's like, man, that was a fun improvement, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But you're not adding something you lacked. It wasn't that.
Well, and I'm not expressing resentment about my house,
That's right. That's
Which is
right.
what I hear a lot in church.
Yes.
Because what I hear a lot is, this is how church hurt my feelings in the past in a real way.
Yeah.
Therefore, I look for that, which we all do that, right? Someone hurt me. For the longest time, there was someone in my life who had hurt me, and every time I met someone whose personality was similar, I would think, I don't trust that person, right?
So that's interesting then. What it really is an accusation at an attempt for justice.
Well, or a defensive response. When your kid thinks you're going to mess with him and he flinches back, it's like, oh, maybe I'm being a little too rough.
Yeah.
Because I've trained in this response. At any rate, the question was about, you were talking about what church should be, and compared to the old sitcom Cheers.
Oh yeah.
And its intro song about everyone knows your name and they're glad you came. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about this because when I think to traditional church, right? Because my default, I think both of ours is, we need to improve something. Well, how was it 150, 200 years ago? Mm-hmm. Maybe that's a better way. Maybe if we just went back, we'd find a simpler time. But when you go back in church, and I don't see a place where church becomes this place you hang out after your labors, right? I see it becoming more formal, and in some sense more regimented and routined as a sacred space that you enter, but you enter with your finest clothes on, right? With your kids in a row and behaving themselves, which is not this place of rest and camaraderie that you're describing.
You're saying when you look back, you don't see a time in that which that was the case, or very
I
many.
don't. I've seen churches do that, but only in very recent times, and it's almost like a deconstructive effort of like we need to redefine church so that it can be more like that positive social atmosphere.
Yeah, I think there were some. The Moravians is one I think about during the the first Great Awakening, and the community. You know, it's interesting that you say it like that because there was a large segment of time when the church was overlapped with the structure of society.
Yeah.
So if you go to the Puritan age, so I'm just thinking about Jonathan Edwards Church or any of these kinds of older things, the social structure was overlaid with the church.
Yeah.
And so it's hard that we don't have that. We don't have that dynamic. In fact, I remember a sermon once from a Puritan.
Not in Oregon, anyway.
Not in Oregon. Well, yeah, not probably anywhere here. But he was talking about it's wrong to punish someone you disagree with theologically. It's wrong to punish them commercially. And I remember thinking, you know, that was a dynamic that they needed to address then when your church relationships and all your other ones are so intertwined. Whereas we don't think that. We don't even think that question, you know, other than that it has recently come up with cancel culture.
Yeah.
But, yeah, it's interesting. And I think that the dynamic of Cheers, I've been thinking this about, I don't remember what we were watching. We watch a Hallmark movie occasionally, anyway, maybe, what's the Andy Griffith one? Not Leave It to Beaver, but the other one.
Is it not just the Andy Griffith Show? No.
The Andy Griffith Show.
Yeah.
Mayberry. That's what it's
Oh,
called.
yeah, right.
The town of Mayberry. You watch shows, and whether it's Mayberry or what's the one with the two ladies, the Gilmore Girls, and they walk around, they know everybody. You know what
Gilmore
the truth?
Girls.
Yeah, the Gilmore. Okay, you didn't have teen girls.
No, I did not.
Anyway, these shows that create
An idyllic community.
they do.
Yeah, it's a small town life.
It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. Even I live in a very small town. It doesn't happen. And it's not that there aren't people that know a lot of people. That's not what I'm saying. But that brother sisterness, or take for example, my wife and I just finished watching. We went through the whole series of Everybody Loves Raymond.
Yeah.
And it's really excellent for married life with kids in a sense. That's what his humor is. But they argue in a way you can't argue like that in real life. Nobody does it like that and can recover. You don't just let it go. You don't get in a big fight with your brother, and the next episode you're back to cheerfulness. In real life, people's feelings are hurt.
They nurse it. Yeah.
It takes a long time, and I began to realize, in one sense, it's not bad. But all these shows, whether secular or Christian, that's not even the point. They're aiming to portray something that is right, but we never achieve it. We don't achieve it.
Well, so what I hear you describing is a healthy marriage is going to part of the dynamic of a healthy marriage is that we're going to disagree, we're going to hurt each other in some way, but we're in it. We're not going to quit, right? And so now imagine that your whole town was that way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because
that's a great analogy.
because the design of a sitcom is these characters aren't going anywhere.
Yeah.
Right? So that means everything is going to get worked out eventually.
That's exactly what I'm at. That's a great analogy.
And there's a longing for that. And
there is.
so that reminds me or makes me think of the dynamic we're facing in our culture of the breakdown of these large institutions, right? And we're on the cusp of a bunch of banks falling under and what's even going on. But I feel like at the heart of it is that relationships are breaking at all these levels. And so people are retreating inward.
Yeah.
You know, we were talking about the community dance we put on and how people just didn't want to come on a way that 5 years ago they did.
Yeah.
And maybe the part of that is one of the lockdown impacts is people have retreated from community in a way that's not healthy.
Good point.
It's kind of sad even.
Yeah. It is interesting. I've thought about that. I just read another article recently, another assessment of revival by Don Carson, and it was very good. He just gave some observations and how to think about them and whatnot. But what I notice is that we are in a peculiar time in which our differences, when we disagree with somebody, they get blown out very quickly in a way that they did not in the past. There's a spirit. So, in my opinion, it's the spirit of the age.
Yeah.
There is something taking place in the invisible realms that is manifesting itself, and that is a spirit of anger, a spirit of division. There's something happening, and it's worldwide, and there is it's infecting all of us, and we don't even realize it. It's in the air we breathe.
Yeah.
Christians, non-Christians, and so I was reading just in doing a lot of thinking about gender and femininity and masculinity, and reading quite a range of things, just thinking through and whatnot. But somebody was talking about even this issue, which is a secondary issue, but it is how a number of these secondary issues biblically are inserting themselves as primary issues. They become something that now, if you don't agree with me, let's say you and I, if you don't agree with me on femininity, whether you're egalitarian or complementarian, if you don't agree with me on Trump or DeSantis, if you don't agree with me on all these things, then I don't have anything to do with you.
So reminds me of a conversation I listened to about the design of social media, and that social media posts get I can't think of the word, promoted based on the amount of controversy present in the discussion.
That's what it is. I think
And
that
so,
dynamic
because just like when we watch TV, right? You can watch a crime show and see the most grisly murder, and then sleep soundly that night.
Yeah.
But with social media, it's more personal.
Yeah.
And so you're taking that same principle of drama. We want drama because that draws us in. But now it's drama. Everyone wants to watch Simon tell people they're a bad singer on American Idol, but no one wants to be told.
That's right.
No one wants to be friends with him when the camera's turned off, because he's a jerk, right? Or Chef Ramsay, Gordon Ramsay, same thing.
Yeah.
We love to watch it. We don't want to live it.
Yeah.
And so we've sort of crossed over because everybody wants that. I wouldn't mind being a little famous, right? So we sort of put ourselves into these reality, and reality TV has created it, that maybe we could be on the screen, and we're infusing that drama, that toxic, I hate that word, but toxicity of relational ill health, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that leads me to my question, which is about culture building. So I'm in this endeavor. Our church is taking me on as a missionary, but not a missionary to Africa, although I do get to go there on Saturday, which I'm excited about, but a missionary to our culture. And sort of part of that is serving in the institution of church, but part of it is serving in the institution of school, but also engaging in things like this, engaging in the political process. Last night at City Council, there's a 2.5-hour meeting where we're discussing what Oregon's going to do with chicken farms, right? And how does it affect other farmers and all. We're trying. So I've heard pastors commonly, when life gets crazy, say, well, we're just going to put our head down and focus on Jesus. I kind of feel like our call is to do the other way, is to say it's time to lift our head up and build a culture that goes beyond the walls of the church. And we've discussed this, what's the church's role? But so you've recently, or in the past, said something to the effect of the concept of entropy applies to culture. That cultures are degraded over time, and it sort of takes a reset, which we've got an attempt at that coming at us from the cultural elites, right? A great reset.
Well, I would say that's still the decline.
It's still because we define the decline as our distance from God in a sense,
that's correct.
right?
We're using
And
categories they don't
so
use.
you can't create a secular revival. You can try; it's not going to work.
Yeah.
Okay, but what I notice is when I look at entropy from a science perspective, entropy is combated by DNA. That life itself combats or reorganizes the chaos and degrading of substances all around us. So you can look at something living and see this incredibly complex and organized redwood tree and know that only life could do that. It wouldn't happen by accident. So my question is, where's the DNA? Where's the life of our culture? Or does it have to happen in these big moments of rebirth and renewal,
What
great
about-
awakening
what
kind of
about-
things?
Let me ask this on the DNA question by way of analogy. What about interbreeding? Would DNA recover from interbreeding? I mean, take all the Georgia jokes you want or whatever, or Louisiana. Or
Oh,
whatever.
inbreeding.
Yeah, inbreeding. Okay.
I was thinking you were talking about like interracial.
No, yeah, I should have
Inbreeding.
said inbreeding.
Can it recover?
Does DNA recover there?
So it would cross generationally. So if you had some inbreeding in your family, but then it didn't continue, and you married from,
So if the
but not within one
the
person.
missteps, right, or not within the children of those. So when you inbreed, in a sense that, let's say you marry or you have children within your own siblings, at this point in time, forget way back in the Old Testament, early days.
Yeah.
But we recognize is that your DNA principle that you basically said is a revitalizing principle.
Yeah.
That God has put life in the earth. It
Yeah.
says in Genesis, he put seeds in the earth, which is an interesting phrase. The earth bears life, and God put it in there to grow up.
Yeah.
But if we do things that corrupt that, is it able to overcome those on its own? Or does the misstep need to be stopped? You have to.
So you're saying there's a life cycle principle as well. That if my DNA, if I have a genetic abnormality of any kind, or even by just getting old, part of getting old is your DNA ages,
Yeah.
right? And so there's no going back.
Well,
So it sounds like you're saying that cultures degrade in the same way that a human body degrades as you age.
By way of the analogy, is there, if you marry your sister and your kids marry one another and their kids marry one another and they have children,
I'm just glad I don't have a sister, so that way this metaphor doesn't get too weird.
What we know is that this will cause a breakdown at the DNA level.
Yeah, but connected to culture, how does that connect?
Well, because I think there's a difference between when DNA can make a recovery within the process of, let's call them standard actions. But if you take destructive actions, can DNA on its own recover? Or does it need an outside intervention to stop the inbreeding? So when we do things culturally that are outside, we'll just give a wide, if an individual marries, Jerry Lee Lewis apparently married a first cousin against the laws way back when, right? Occasionally things like that happen. We don't see a big ripple effect, right? It's an occasion.
Okay.
But if you continue that, it will not be recoverable. DNA can't overcome it. It appears. I'm saying that when you say DNA, I agree with you, but I also think that there is a degradation that can be accelerated. There's a degradation that can be where we take missteps that intentionally make it so that we can't recover.
So what is the cultural equivalent that you're making to an inbreeding? Are you saying, like, is there some facet of the way culture replenish? I mean, as you say it, I think all of our cultural artifacts right now are just rehashing the same stories and characters, So I remember when I was a kid seeing Back to the Future 2, when Marty goes into the future, right? And the joke was that it was Jaws, like the 20th, Jaws 20 or something like that. And I was like, haha, they're going to keep making those movies forever. And they didn't, maybe because of that joke. But now, how many Spider-Man iterations have we had just in the last decade? Like almost a dozen. So we're on that train. How many different, we are creating like almost a Greek mythology in the sense that we have key characters. So like James Bond, Spider-Man, right? These key characters that they just get redone, but it's the same iteration. It's almost like the inbreeding culturally.
So to jump from the analogy into where I would probably have thoughts would be to say, when I hear you say DNA, culture building, I'm thinking that what's being communicated or thought is we want a setting, a secular, not secular. It's not that we want secular, but we want the functioning society that is going to include Christians and not Christians, to be functioning at an increased level of honoring good things that God made. So let's say honesty.
Yeah.
The bank failed. We don't really know. We're not being told what happened. I don't understand finance enough to know.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that the bonuses were given to the employees and the managers cashed out for multiple millions of dollars within the last 2 weeks.
The managers or the executives?
The executives.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So what we see there is something fundamentally dishonest and a
Yeah.
lack of integrity, right? When I hear you say culture building, what I hear you saying is there was a time when that wouldn't have been a common thing. That would have been quite unusual, and people would have gone to jail for that kind of act.
Yeah.
Culture had a healthier dynamic with just basic ABC good things like being truthful or not stealing, whatever, right?
Yeah.
And then what I'm hearing you say is that culture building, what you would like to do is reinvest in order to get to that place of operating again. Because you're not saying that you want to reduce and there be no more sin or destruction. You can't do that.
Well,
Nobody does. But you want
you always
to a
aim for
certain-
perfection, knowing you won't achieve it, right?
Okay.
So what I would the way I would describe our culture. So I was thinking about this because I was trying to break this down because I'm giving presentations to people to bring on as like sponsors, right? And so how do I describe what culture building is? And the best I've got is that it comes down to institutions and relationships, relational health, and then leadership, like a vision for the future. And so if you're going to look at some of these cultural iconic architecture, right? More people visit Europe than live in Europe every year, and they're going to see buildings for the most part, right?
Okay.
So you look at this incredible building, or here's a better example. I went to Peru 20 some years ago, and we went to Machu Picchu and Cusco, and these giant stones fitted together flawlessly without mortar. So the sign of that culture, besides saying, well, wow, we can employ a lot of slaves to build something really precise, but you can't just be a mindless slave. You have to be a craftsman, right? It requires fitting those stones. And the Bible sort of talks about this, that we're being fitted together as living stones. Well, how do you get them to fit? You got to smooth the rough edges. And what I think right now of our culture is that it's like a pile of broken up concrete. Have you ever seen people put out for free? You can have all the broken concrete we took out. It's like, nobody wants that. But imagine saying, go build a cathedral with all the broken up concrete that somebody took out. And you can't do it except with a huge amount of investment in taking that broken concrete and like smoothing it, shaping it to fit together. And what relationships are, so if the institutions are the part that, I don't know, my metaphor is breaking down as I think about it, but so we've got a broken culture that's down to each one of us is not good at fitting together with others, right? And that brings me back to that Cheers question. So in the early church, you've got not just that they're gathering together in big crowds, we've sort of substituted that as our only church and made it into a performance. And we sit and review it afterward. How was the sermon? How was the worship? But rather, they did that, but then they lived together in each other's homes, sharing with each other. And in those homes, not just friendship, but ministry. And it's the stones getting smoothed out through the process of relationship, but also through the process of God's presence being there. So how do we build that again?
So let me ask you this. Do you see that, how do you build that as the church doing that? Or because when you say that, I think to myself, okay, the first century church existed in a culture that was, it was a brand new thing. God brought together a new thing. There had always been a
But it's
Jewish
not
people.
unique to the early church for people to be living together, breaking bread, praying for each other. Like that's a pretty consistent church activity.
Well, I'm just saying that when it's this thing that we're calling church, this community, that all of a sudden the walls of Israel are broken down. Because this same thing was Israel earlier.
Yeah.
But it was covenantal, it was geographic, it was political. God put up the structures of civil things in order to make it work.
Yeah.
And then when Jesus comes, he tears down that and says, now I'm going to make this spiritual, but it's all over the earth.
Right.
It's not geographically bound. It's not biologically bound to Abraham, right?
Yeah.
And so you have this new thing that happens. Well, I don't see that when that happens, I don't see them trying to recover culture. I don't see them going to Rome and saying, we want to make you better.
Well,
We want,
but culture is intergenerational. So you don't go to your ailing grandfather and say, "Man, we just really going to recover your body." Instead, you bring him to peace as in the process of his body naturally decaying, and in hopes of Christ, you say farewell. But what the early church was doing is saying, "Okay, this is something new. Let's build it."
though, what I'm hearing you say when you say it that way is they're building their own community inside of an antagonistic culture. They're building
Sure.
their own culture
Yeah.
in the hopes that as Grandpa dies, this new thing will take over and spread.
Well, there's
That
no
would
hope
be-
required. Grandpa's going to die, and the new thing's going to spread. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's a little different because Nero is replaced by whatever. The guy Nero is the bad guy, but the one who went and salted Palestine, I don't even remember his name right now. That's not Nero. In other words, Grandpa dies, you're right, but the spirits of the world don't, and they raise up another individual.
Right.
So I guess when I think about it that way, that's why you and I probably have come at it from different angles. I view it as not a DNA answer. I think there's limitations on DNA.
I mean, we're trying to stretch a metaphor.
I know
for sure.
we're using a metaphor and stretching it, but I think that it has to be infused with something outside and that's what I think it's a gospel issue. So when you said earlier, put your head down and focus on Jesus. So to me, though, I would rephrase that. If I was saying that, I wouldn't have used the word put your head down. I understand why people are saying it, but I agree with you that that's not a good picture nor dynamic. It's more of lift your eyes up. But I do agree with the latter part, that it's the focus on the gospel. So to me, culture building is a fruit of God doing something. And I don't know that when we get to it, that's why I brought up the whole thing about inbreeding. When you get to a certain place, you've injected destruction, it takes an outside event to stop it, because the DNA is no longer functioning the way it's supposed to function.
So what I'm saying is that I think the call of God is beyond saying, because part of it is whenever we say, well, this is what the church needs to do, what I think I hear, and I think it's common, is it's what pastors need to do, right? But what I'm saying is the people of God need to engage in rebuilding the walls that are broken in every setting, in every institution.
Yes.
So I remember I watched that old series, The Band of Brothers, right? And it was a World War II European theater.
I saw it.
And at one of the last episodes, maybe the very last one, they're going through a town in Germany after vanquishing the Nazis, and walking through the streets are all these Germans, and they're sweeping and they're picking up. And from the day that it ended, they're saying, okay, it's time to rebuild. Like we're done.
Yeah.
But their immediate impulse is not necessarily, that's a godly impulse is what I'm saying. But it's just as godly to build your house as it is to build the church if they both are serving God, even though institutions and authorities are separated.
I agree with you. I mean,
So part of what I feel called to do is to say, okay, to each Christian, right, as I go to small groups or as I connect with churches all around our area, how are you building culture? How is God calling you to build something good, but not just to make money to have a life that people would envy, but to say, well, for example, God gave you money. God gave you the ability to make wealth. Let's build with it.
When you said that, how are you building culture? I thought you were going to say, how are you living out your calling? Because that's what Luther and then we said, in the Reformation.
I think that's what I'm saying.
How come why do you call it culture building? And why do you not call it The old word, and I'm not saying it's good or bad, I'm
Yeah.
interested in your response.
Yeah.
The old idea is that if you're called to be a mother, if you're called to change diapers, if you're called to be a baker, if you're called to be a politician, live in that calling, and they're holy. It doesn't. It's that in
Yeah.
that sense.
You got a mission.
The pastor is not more holy than the cobbler, the one making shoes,
Yeah.
and that was a revelation to the medieval structures that had developed about
Sure.
you really to be a nun or a priest. That's the only holy thing to really honor God. Luther said, no, make good beer if you're a beer maker,
Yeah.
right?
He enjoyed it.
Well, he did that too. Now,
Well, so the difference I'm saying is I don't want to restrict it to vocational.
Why do you call, so tell me what do you mean by that?
Well, so if,
Why do you call it culture building and not vocational pursuits?
because I think it's too narrow.
In what way?
So if God's called me to be a school teacher and I serve my time and I'm doing a good job, then the rest of my efforts, the rest of my thinking, and I've experienced this as a husband. So I go to work, I put my creative and my analytical efforts into doing a good job at work, and then I come home and it's like, now it's time to turn that off, and I'm neglecting my wife, I'm neglecting the kids, right? Because it's like I think I've done my work, my calling, rather than saying, okay, every moment that I build my children to be young men of God, every moment that I build up my wife to be fulfilled and embracing the place then I'm serving,
Right.
I'm building a culture, right? So then so it's not enough. I mean, it's not sufficient, or it's too narrow of a vision for the future. Because when we all just do our part in our own spot and say, leave me be to do a good job, what I've noticed is I'm looking around and the culture's falling apart.
So the traditional way of expressing that, and you're expressing it differently, so I'm intrigued by that. But the traditional way is that when it comes to vocations, you have multiple. The first is your heart. This would be Puritan teaching, right?
Okay.
The first is your heart, to
Yeah.
keep your heart before God. The second is your duties as a husband with your wife.
Sure.
Then as a father. Then your calling in the social sphere. Maybe even your neighbor as a friend might even be before that, or maybe it would be after. But so there's this structure built that, there are prioritizations, but your callings really, in a sense, like you said, never end.
Yeah.
They're not 9 to 5, and that they're not the profession that you're in. But it is there, but it's lower down the thing. That's the traditional way of saying it. Why are you saying it? Why are you adding this idea of culture building? What is it because of what's taking place?
Well, in the
That
same
there's a
way that I was
tearing apart
describing,
and a time of destruction that is really unprecedented.
Yeah.
Our nation.
So I think culture is where I see the problems. So in the sense that, in the same way I was talking about
Culture.
when I was talking about my pastor friends saying, I'm going to put my head down and focus on Jesus, I see other Christian men and women say, I'm going to put my head down and focus on my kids. I'm going to put my head down and focus on my job. And then when they look around, they see chaos. And they say, how did that chaos get there? Well, because our head was down. Rather than saying, okay, this is my town. How can I serve it? This is my state, and it's crazy. And there's, gun battles in the streets between political opponents.
Yeah.
And so, it's time to be leaders in those arenas too. And so what the call to vocation is, I think, too narrow, because it says, well, the rest of it is up to God, or really it's given over to Satan. It's all going to burn. We're just waiting for the rapture, rather than saying, no, these are our schools. So let's build them up. Let's take dominion of them. Just like we do, people fight over how the pews should be arranged at church.
Okay, so let me ask you another question on that. Would you be saying the same thing? So we have this moment in time, this snapshot right now, and we are what we are. We're not what we were as a country, culturally.
Right.
And there is an increased antagonism. Now, let's just say, okay, you've made a case there in that context. And so I've tried to hear why, right?
Yeah.
Now, let's take your why and jump 50 years into the future.
Okay.
100 years, 50 years, 100 years, some period of time.
Is it a dystopian future?
No,
Are there
well, a
zombies
little
and
bit. No.
and
Not that
cyborgs
dystopian.
everywhere?
Well, cyborgs maybe.
Definitely.
But, and the antagonism has been ratcheted up to where it's not just a spirit of anti and of mockery
Yeah.
and of being, now we're at a place right now where can be thrown, our country can hold you in jail without cause. That's
talking
what
about
they're
January
doing.
6th.
I am talking
Yep.
about that. A
Yeah.
lot of those people are Christian individuals that are being held because of their fundamental opposition, not because of the things that happened on January 6th or the things they did.
Right.
So they're being held in many respects because of an element of faith that's existent, or truth telling, or whatever you want to say. Let's ratchet up to where that accelerates, and now in Canada, for example, you can be thrown in prison, literally by law, if you were to preach that we believe biblically that homosexual activity is a sin.
Yeah.
You can be thrown in jail.
Especially if you say that individual homosexuals need to not only repent, but
That's
seek
right.
restoration
Stop.
and healing.
That's
And
right.
now you're in conversion
That's
therapy.
right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say we go there.
Okay.
And now we have people put in prison.
Well, I'll tell you,
We
Oregon's
also-
not far in the sense that those same laws are in Oregon, but they only apply to licensed therapists.
Okay, I understand. Yes, I
Right?
agree with you. I agree with you that we're not far,
Yeah.
but we're also miles away from that being a way of life. Because you and I are sitting here talking on open air,
Yeah.
and that doesn't happen in China.
So you're saying we're miles away from the arena and the mocking crowd
That's right.
laughing as Christians are torn
Or
asunder.
It's modern versions. So we're not an underground church. You and I go to church, and we do so freely.
Yeah.
When you say take back dominion of culture things, you can actually say that.
Well, but
There's another place that you can't say that. That's not even on the table.
so what I'm trying to do is say,
Does your reason
Let's
hold
fight-
when you get there?
well, I think it does, in the sense that, in the same way that if you, thinking of the early church, if you look at the ambitions of the apostles, especially Paul, to pursue and take the gospel to positions of power, that we're going to go to Caesar with the gospel. We're going to go to the households of high-ranking and influential people and declare it fearlessly. And that's what caused that persecution. So, for example, in China, you can legally be a Christian if you go to the Chinese-approved, Chinese-appointed government churches. And we're not far from that either. If you look at how the churches, many of these mega churches in particular, responded to COVID, it was just looking at the government saying, tell us what to say, and then wrapping it in Christian language and putting it out, right? And you still have that on a scale, but now it's a battle within churches. Is the mandate to take dominion of every institution as Christians? That's kind of what I hear you asking, especially as those institutions are hostile. But I think it'll always be there because all authority has been given to Jesus, therefore we should go.
Yeah. So this is where we're probably going to see things differently. However, when I say that, I'm trying to figure out here, because what you said earlier about each individual Christian and calling, see, I agree with that.
Yeah.
But I'm probably not on the same page when we start thinking about, I'm trying to get at it, what is it exactly? But it's this taking dominion. I'm not sure if this is right, but the taking dominion of the institutions. I don't know if I think that is right. And your appeal was to all authority has been given me. But that is, I don't know that that applies. I think not that it doesn't apply. I don't think that was its primary point of emphasis. The authority it gives me is therefore go and teach and baptize and
Well, so let me give you an example. You like Ron DeSantis.
I do.
Okay. I don't want Ron DeSantis to, as his position as governor, to take church doctrines and enforce them in the sense of like he's going to preach sermons, right? He's going to baptize. I don't want him doing any of that because that's not the authority of a governor. The authority of the governor is to establish and enforce right laws. And so as Christian as I think he is, right? Because who can know? I want him to do that with the power that he's given. So he's taking dominion of the role of governor by representing God in that role and not just giving it up and saying, well, what can you do?
What I hear you saying is when he says all authority has been given to me, pause, and you say all authority at every level.
At every level. In every institution.
You say, unpause. The next part of that verse is now I'm applying it to these people in this level that they're in.
Yeah.
And that just means that I didn't speak anything about the authority of a politician in that verse.
Well, so look at how John the Baptist, when the centurion comes and says, "What do I do?" He says, "Well, you need to be a centurion in a godly way." Right? You could make the argument that the sphere of authority for a family is separate from that of a church. But the church still has a lot to say about family. And so what we want to do is, what does the church have to say about family? It's saying in a moral sense, this is the right way to structure and live. I think the church has the same things to say to government. Not necessarily what form of government or what structure, but what are the right laws? And God has a lot of laws that he's given us to say. And you know, they're going to apply to a different level. You're going to look for the principle behind what the law is so that we can apply it in our setting and in our, not cultural difference, but technological difference, right? But all of that is the dominion of Christ. And we know that because when Christ returns, he will establish a government. He will establish families. He will establish all these domains, not just a church.
Yeah, I'm going to have to think about that. I'm not sure if I see it that way.
Well, and I don't know. I mean, we keep coming back to this.
Yeah,
It's interesting.
I know we do. It's good to keep coming back to things, and I suppose that's I don't think you feel bad. I certainly don't think I feel bad. Sometimes I think people who listen. I know that my wife would feel bad if I am talking with somebody about something and they're seeing different, I'm seeing differently, and we talk about it, and we're on the fifth time talk about it. She starts feeling bad. I don't, because I think that as long as there's...
Does she feel bad because she thinks you're making me feel bad?
Well, I wasn't using you in particular, but yes.
But I mean, in that dynamic,
yes,
right? Yeah.
Or that
I feel okay.
Its level of importance is not, is it that important?
Oh,
and
yeah.
I think there's a rightness, but as long as, and I think part of it is, it can be men and women, but there are an element of vying for something that you can do with somebody that doesn't compromise your relationship with them, and yet you can still push back and say, I don't see it that way. Help me hear you again. Or you can come to a point where I just don't see that. I don't agree with that. I think that's so. Right now, I'm feeling like that verse. I've never heard it that way, and I'm gonna have to think about that way. Do I think that verse, all authority is everything, and then the next phrase is limited to one of those? Because I've never taken that way. I've always taken about the all authority is connected to the sphere he's talking about, and that's all he's talking about. He's not talking about the other authorities. That's how I've always taken that verse.
Oh, yeah, right.
He's not talking about family authority or political authority when he says all authority has been given to me. It's not that those authorities aren't, but that's not what that verse is saying. That's how I've always taken it. So I'm going to have to go and reflect on that and see what I think over time, and we'll come back. So to me, it doesn't bother me to have these ongoing discussions where we keep coming back to some things, because you know what, that's the way I've changed my mind about several things. I used to have a conversation like this with a friend in California who was charismatic. He was believed in the ongoing gifts of the Spirit, and I did not. And we probably had this conversation for maybe 3 or 4 years. And I was interested in it, not just relationally, but I was interested in it theologically, and I went back to explore something that I had assumed that I believed, and I had my reasons for it.
Yeah.
I ended up changing my mind.
Interesting.
In a very real respect, he won the argument over a long period of time, though that wasn't his intention to win the argument.
So have you? Here's the.
However, let me.
Yeah, I was going to say, how many spiritual gifts have you asked God for?
Oh, that I didn't know you were going to ask that.
Maybe that's a little more than. But how many?
Asking particular, it was saying to God, I'm open to any of them.
Yeah, there you go.
Right.
Right.
Because I don't know what it's going to mean, and I did pray and ask God for speaking in tongues, and pursued it for a season.
Yeah.
And it's a little awkward to say it. I'll tell you a funny story. When I first changed my mind on this topic, I went into a bookstore. There were stores with books at that day. And
there were stores.
And there was no Amazon. I went in, and I decide I'm going to go buy a couple of these books, not on the argument side, but within the circle of believing in gifts.
Okay.
And
to see how they talk among themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
In other words, I changed my mind. Now I'm open to something. Now I want to read from their side, not their side debating my side or my side debating their side. That's what I've been reading already, right?
Right.
Now I want to read their books inside the world. How do they talk about it? How do they approach about it? I maybe bought 3 or 4 books. I was embarrassed.
What do you mean?
I was embarrassed.
Just to buy them?
Yes.
Oh.
It was so ingrained in me a perspective.
Yeah.
When I went to the counter, I felt like looking around and would anybody see me? I was embarrassed with the cashier. And then I was totally stunned by being embarrassed.
Right. It surprised you.
I didn't know that was going to happen. And it's just how deep-seated your thoughts are. And I've been very open with my friend, and I think I'm a very broad-minded individual, but I didn't realize I had deep-seated emotional things to it too.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that we identify with our tribes within Christianity. Pretty powerfully.
True. Yeah. So.
All right, so we need to get to a topic that's been we covered it a little bit before.
How far are we past? I just turned my.
Oh, we're at 50 minutes.
Oh my goodness!
I know.
This is by 20 minutes.
All right, so we're talking about virtues of the feminine and the masculine again, and you've been reflecting on this.
I have. Okay, so let me say. Well, let me start with a little article I found and by a lady, because I was thinking about this. One of the things I would like, I've said this before, I'd like it if we had a couple ladies sitting here and have a 4-person discussion on some of this. Because it's interesting. So I'm male, and I think what that does, I can't think except with maleness.
Sure, I guess.
And so there's a limitation.
Yeah.
But sometimes from the outside you see things that are clearer than when you see on the inside. And so there's like this double-edged sword. So I like that this is a lady who wrote this, and she's asked some questions that were intriguing to me, and I'll take that as a backstop because I still want to get back into a little bit of 1 Timothy 2. Okay, so what is her name's here? Helen Roy. She contributes to the American Mind, has a podcast called Girl Boss. Anyway, wrote an article on the body and the soul.
Okay.
Right? And as a woman. And here's what she says. She's a Catholic lady, which is interesting because Catholics have some robust thinking in areas that evangelicals have not thought through.
Well, they've had time.
They've had time, but they also have Aristotle. That has a good and a bad. And so, and through Aristotle, they have Aquinas. So he's one of the greats. But what that does is they have some insights into things that evangelicals don't, because they don't have that philosophical background. But they also, in my opinion, have they can rely upon Aristotle and the philosophy more than they can on Scripture, and they can have a reasoned thing, and yet then you look at Scripture, and I just don't think it says that.
Yeah.
Right.
Not everything that's logical is biblical.
That's exactly right. All right. So here's what she writes: according to the principle of, and then it's a Latin phrase, anima forma corpus. It comes, anyway. The soul is the essential whatness of the body, is what she says.
Okay.
The principle that explains its organization and makes it really alive. Our bodies are not appendages for our souls.
Right.
To play with, or lumps of clay in which our souls are trapped. Rather, the body is like the language in which the soul is expressed. The body is the language in which the soul is expressed.
Okay.
And through which the soul makes contact with the outside world, cultivates knowledge and virtue, and lives an ethical and political life. There is no such thing as a body being wrong for its soul. Now this gets into the transgenderism issue.
Oh, yeah.
Right? For the simple reason that each is fully known only with reference to the other. Now I'm going to pause there, and then she takes a step from there.
Well, the theology of the body is huge.
Interesting. It is.
It's also very separated. So it also connects with abortion in the sense that it's like, well, it's just a body, referring to the baby.
A lump of mass, yeah.
Right? It's not a
Tissue.
soul.
That's right.
And obviously the
Far-reaching.
transgender application.
Yes.
I heard a Catholic priest talking about abortion as the sacrament for a pagan spirituality
Yeah.
that even uses the similar language of "this is my body," which is the words of Christ, right?
I think there's something there.
Yeah.
What's interesting about this is what she said is the opposite of what I have thought without giving it thought. And that is, we die, been to deaths, been to funerals, been there moments after an individual passed away.
Mm-hmm.
You look at the body, and they're not there.
Correct.
Their body is there, and it's a weird thing. Sobering. And I have assumed, without thought, that the soul is the real thing, and the body is just an appendage or something that the soul can live without the body. That the
Right.
soul, and not that it was going to, but it can. That it's a just the suitcase, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And
Well,
what
it's like when
she's-
you're in a car. You're not the car.
That's
You're just
exactly
in the
right.
car.
That's right. That's
Right.
right. What she's saying is that's not true. She's asserting that this body is the expression of the soul.
So if that were the case, right, that would, well, one, that would explain Christians' tendency to burial rather than something like cremation,
Okay.
historically, because we want to preserve this sense of this self.
Okay.
The other thing dawns on me is, in the same way that the corrupt spirits that were cast out of the demoniac long to be embodied, right? Would that then mean even the spirits dwelling in holiness now with Christ in heaven, they also long to be re-embodied
Yes.
at Christ's
Yes.
return?
Yes.
That there's a like,
Yes.
I wish I could be back in there.
Yes.
And you see that in cultural artifacts about ghosts, right? Where the ghost longs to interact with the human world and can't.
That's right. That's right. Edwards had a sermon, a famous sermon on it, in which he said that you will long with all of your might, and you will have no greater joy up to that point than when you are restored with your glorified body, and
Yeah.
you are made whole again. Anyway, what was struck with this, was well, obviously there's the transgender and the dilemma stuff that's today, and I'm going to go on and read a little bit more about kind of dilemma stuff. But this was, I thought, a great insight, and for me at least, because what it did is it attached to 1 Timothy 2, that God formed the man.
Yeah,
The word is where we get plastic, shaped and molded.
yeah,
And what I began to think is this thought: what if the way we are physically, male and female,
yeah,
biologically, is not a choice that God made just for our bodies and for procreation, but they're an expression of the soul He breathes into us?
because they're inseparable.
Because if it's inseparable, if what she's saying is true,
Yeah,
then the shape of the male body, the shape of the female, the physicality,
right.
are themselves expression of femininity and masculinity.
Well, and you could see that by the fact that how personalities are changed by physiological change. So if you increase testosterone in somebody's body,
If you go the other way,
right, what you also increase is pleasure in effort. That somebody is working hard and it feels good,
right?
right?
Right.
And I remember reading to the boys when they were little, one of these like Hardy Boys kind of books. And there was an older character, and she says to a young man in the story, you look really happy. You must be working hard. As if the physical manual labor
Yes.
to a young man who's at his peak testosterone
Yes.
is going to bring him a joy, a physical
right.
joy
That's right.
that bleeds into the soul.
That's right.
So, and in the same way, you can,
I think that's right.
I think we've all experienced, like I remember when we first got married, my wife got onto birth control pills, which are a hormone replacement,
Yeah.
tricking her body into thinking it's pregnant.
Yeah.
And it didn't just mess with her body, it messed with her personality, right? And we had a lot of friends the same way, and we made the choice, not only for that reason, but for moral reasons around abortion,
Yeah.
to step away from that form of birth control.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, the fact that it can go the other way is an indication of it. I agree. So what that ended up making me think is, okay, so when God made, it's interesting that the story of creation, He makes man through one set of processes, but not the same set for a woman in the story.
Yeah, right.
I wonder to myself why. Why dust of the earth is for man and in a sense mankind,
Right.
but then the story about woman is the rib,
Yeah.
actually a hard place of man, a bone place,
Structure.
a structure place, and yet her physiology is relative softness, which Helen is going to bring up in a moment.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. But why the from dirt formed
Yeah.
and then from rib formed? Do you have any thoughts? Why tell
No.
the male female part different?
Well, my thoughts that jumps to the glory of God and the glory of man. But I don't have
Which
any
man are you
connection.
talking about, male or mankind?
Male. That right, and so that there's a degraded version of this, which is like
Yes.
arm candy,
Yes, yes,
right?
yes, yes, yes.
And in the same way, men
Yes.
can be degraded in their own ways. But this idea of I don't have a connection between that and soil versus ribs. Yeah, I don't know.
So, well, I think what you're saying is the right one. I'm still trying to think about it too, but what I feel the weight of is when I think about this, and if I were to talk about it in our politically explosive environment where the subject itself is rife with hurt feelings, distortions,
Yeah,
I find myself wanting to think about it and talk about it and learn about it, and then careful to express it, right? So that it could be heard
sure.
and not hurtful. So when I think about it, I think, so arm candy is a distortion
Yeah,
of another idea. I heard an old pastor say once, put woman in her place. Her place is by your side with your arm around her,
right. Yeah,
right? And there isn't, well, I was about to say there's not a woman on the planet who doesn't want that. I suppose in antagonism there could be postures against that.
well, there's not a woman who's embracing her femininity. So one of the things I enjoy,
Yeah.
when I look for a perspective from women, which I do consistently, I look for a woman who's embracing her feminine virtues.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
If she's trying to pursue masculine virtues, then I don't feel like I'm going to get a good reflection of what it means to be a woman
Yes.
from someone who doesn't want to be a woman.
In fact, tongue in cheek, you could think to yourself, well, if I wanted a guy's opinion, I'd go ask a guy.
And I've seen several conversations about dating between men and women because I call this the lingering effect of Andrew Tate, because he had so many comments about women from this macho, degraded perspective, right? But in a lot of ways, it was true when he was talking about women who've kind of swallowed lies, feminist lies versus feminine virtues. But one of the things that keeps coming up is, in fact, I was reading this woman's post, and she was talking about men, and this is something I've heard people talk about in marriage a lot, right? When men want sex so that they know they're okay in their relationship, women want to know they're okay in a relationship, and then they'll have sex.
Yes.
And it's sort of this balanced intertwine in marriage.
Yeah.
But one of the things she was saying is, she was looking at these survey results of satisfaction in their sexual life among people in long-term relationships, and the graph sadly was just kind of going down, which I think I don't know if that's true in my experience. I would say I've been more satisfied in sex the longer we've been married,
Yeah.
but with ups and downs, obviously.
Yeah.
But her argument, and I don't know if she's a Christian, but what conservative, was that women want things. Women want from men to feel satisfied and content, like the house or the car or the things that kind of like, this is what I'm hungry for. Whereas, and that inspires men to go out and earn things,
Yeah.
but then so they can get the sex, because sex is what makes them feel like, okay, things are all right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about the dynamic of this, the soft and the hard and the side to side, and how that all interplays.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. So we watch some home HGTV stuff periodically.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife is far more interested in it than I am. I'm not uninterested. And I walked in the other day, and there was one on a weekend, and it's this husband and wife, and they're rehabbing homes for friends and whatnot.
Yeah.
It's not the Joanna, it's another couple. But there's a bunch of couples.
There's an infinite.
Right?
Yeah.
And what's so interesting is that the shows are, almost all of them, driven by the delight of the woman, facilitated by the interest and fix-it of the man. And they do it as a team, and almost all of them, it's a really healthy team. But their interests are different.
Yeah.
And she's interested, she gets deep pleasure from this house being put together. And then they bring the couple in, right? And they see it for the first time. You know what? It's always the case. The man goes silent for the most part, and he is affected, but she's in tears.
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And she's blown away. And what's happening, and he's excited too. I'm not meaning to downplay, right? But it's because for her, this as facilitating, aligning itself with, I think, the way God made her to care for things and nurture things and provide this place of safety and comfort and security, and him to build it,
Yeah.
or him to be a part of that, but hers to, in a sense, run that side of things, if you would say.
Well, so that draws me to a conversation we were having with my wife and a younger mom in our church about these collection of younger moms who long for older women to sort of show them how to
Yeah.
be good moms.
Yeah.
Because it feels
Yeah.
like you've got media and then you're sort of guessing.
Yeah, that's
You
right.
know, maybe
I
you've
agree.
got a couple of older relatives, your mother, your mother-in-law. But that, again, that community
It's
concept.
an untapped opportunity, but I think people are afraid to step into it. I think the older moms and ladies are afraid because they have been brutally beat down in the choices they've made, brutally beat down in the values they've sought to
In
express.
the kind of judgmental mom,
That's right.
toxic mom culture.
And they are frightened to death of wanting to come alongside of a young woman and say, here's why I did this. And you might find some differences, but I think overall you'll be happier if you trot down
Well,
this path.
so one of the things that Nicole had to kind of face was the idea that, one, she's one of the older moms now.
Yeah,
Our
that's-
boys are
that's
teenagers;
weird.
they're on the
I know.
cusp of moving out.
I know.
But the other was that that they want it, that these young moms, and so it feels like you're putting yourself out there a little bit.
Yeah. Or at least
What I
want
noticed,
something.
what I noticed is that because we're still like church plants, right, versus established churches, church plants are mostly younger couples. And so for the first,
true.
we're passing our 10-year mark, and so now you've got 10 years of people having babies, and now you can start to look back and help people coming up.
Yeah.
But that's one of the things churches segregate by age. They self-segregate, and in that way, they rob each other. Where you might have a church full of older ladies who could be ministering, but they have no one to minister to.
Yeah.
And on the other side, you've got our church
I
where
agree.
there's a handful of women who are older,
Yeah.
trying to help maybe a dozen or 24 women, and it's a challenge.
Yeah. So I'm probably not going to get to the second part of her stuff here, so I'm not going to try. I'm going to save it for another time. And it really is what she's talking about, the defining physical realities of the female, and she has 3 of them.
Yeah.
And they're very interesting, and I want to talk about them another time. And then she actually explores that they show not only a path to virtue, but a pathway for vice as well.
Sure.
And then that got me thinking about the male ones. And I think I would add 1 or 2 to hers that I don't think she has in hers. But then I thought, what are the male ones? And you're basically working from observable dynamics to say these are connected to paths of virtue. Mm-hmm. But the dangerous part of that is they're general truths. And so you get back to Genesis 2, the formation of Adam and Eve, and I think what you begin to see here, at least the way I began to think about it in the 1 Timothy 2 passage, is that we're tempted to read that as if Paul is limiting and holding, and he says what he says in order to hold women back, and as if there's a deficiency. I've been doing some reading about the laws of sexual discrimination and in the workplace, and there used to be laws that women, they couldn't hold land.
Well, there's 2 ways to hold someone back. You hold someone back from the good that they could otherwise do, and that's a corrupt way to do it. Or you hold someone back from an error that they can't foresee.
Yes, that's right.
Right?
I agree.
Yeah.
That's a good point. In a sense, there is a holding back in that respect. But what I began, okay, you know what? I'm glad you said that. I might have to add that to my thoughts. But the thing that what I felt was underneath the passage in 1 Timothy 2, and its restriction, was being tied to Genesis, that when God formed the man, plastic molded, and then he formed the woman with a rib, and he gave to the one, what he called masculine, and
Yeah.
it was him. He gave things in God.
Yeah.
When he gave to the woman a soul, which was going to make her body what it is,
Yeah.
he gave to her a set of traits that were in him, And I'm thinking to myself, I believe the word masculine and feminine could have been flip-flopped. All the traits we think of men, he could have called, the names are less important than what they are as a reflection of his attributes.
Okay.
So
So what do you do with the idea that man is made in God's image and woman is made in man's image?
I think that's
'Cause
another
woman is
leap
both.
down the way.
Because
Yeah.
woman is stated as being made in God's image, right? Male and female, he created them. But also that she is the image or the reflection or the glory. I think they're
Yes.
probably
So
all
I was gonna say,
together.
I didn't think it was the word image in the same way,
Okay.
but it is a connection there. And
But they're stated side by side, right? That man is the image of God and woman is the image of
in the
man.
1 Corinthians passage,
Yeah.
does it say image? I don't think it says the image of man.
Oh, I'll have to look.
I think your word glory was
Well, maybe the
but-
two are interchangeable too. I don't know.
well, so here's what I'm thinking as I've been thinking about this in the 1 Timothy passage. When you come to God as a being, one being, the end of the New Testament ends up telling us that there's three persons. And we don't understand that. It's not how we're made, but God says this is how I am. There's one God, but he exists as three persons. Within that three persons existence, there's complete equality. But they have taken functional and perhaps, according to their distinct natures, separate roles. So Jesus, as expressing the Trinity, they took to themselves maleness, and that's a separate conversation. I don't want to have that one today. But Jesus takes those expressions of deity that are reflected in feminine. He has masculine too. I'm not going to say that. But it's the Father who says, go and do this. And the Son says, I'll go and do what you will.
Yeah.
And so this, in a sense, submission of sonship to Father,
Right.
I think, is what is reflected in feminine and masculine. And nobody would say that Jesus' submission is of secondary importance.
Right.
Rather, that it's full of glory.
Yeah.
That the authority, when Jesus says, if I wanted to call 10,000 angels to exert my authority, I could.
Yeah.
That's the masculine. I could go to war. I am going to war on another way.
Well, and I will later.
And I will
Right.
express myself
Because
that way.
that's part of why John the Baptist
right.
was saying, is there another one coming? Because you've got all these prophecies of the day of the Lord.
Yes.
And that day will come and
Yes.
it'll be full of
That's
vengeance and
right.
wrath.
That's right.
Yeah.
But the current time is an expression of attaining victory through it's a submission to something.
Yeah.
And it even looks like he's getting killed.
Yeah.
And I think what we've had occur is that in the reflection of sin added to the world, masculine has, because of the strength of biceps and shoulders and whatnot, said and some other things, we're going to
Trapezoids.
say,
Traps too, not just
Traps.
biceps. Yeah.
That's right. We're going to say that the elements of womanhood are of lesser significance.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lie.
Because if you see the world as only about obtaining power,
That's right.
then
That's right.
the people in power are
When
superior.
power becomes the defining characteristic,
Yeah.
then the muscular strength all of a sudden you rise up and we all acknowledge it.
Well, and the way you can see that too is, and I see this with many other traits, where the trait that you see your enemies always living out is usually the trait that drives you. So everyone's jealous of me. Well, you're probably driven by jealousy in levels that you're not willing to admit. And in the same way, people who will describe our culture as just about power and therefore corrupt, right? They're criticizing that. They also then see the solution as, I have to get power.
Yeah.
And that's what's degrading about politics too.
When you go and I've had multiple occasions where somebody in a church setting and somebody talks about another person and says, he's so proud. It's
Yeah.
always a proud person that says that.
Right.
It always is, because you notice that. You notice your own failing and you don't like it.
Okay, so here's an image. We've talked about this a little bit in the past. I described it as the difference between sexual tension and the battle of the sexes.
Yes,
But I've got a
good.
better
I'm glad you got
better
it.
metaphor I want to
All
add.
right.
Okay.
You're not going to say that point at all?
Well, I'm going to describe it in a different way.
Okay.
And that is that the difference between a tug of war, and I don't know if I've talked about this in a previous episode, the difference between a tug of war and a rugby scrum.
Okay.
Okay, so if the sexes, if masculine and feminine, or I think of it in terms of the culture war, right? If the honor culture versus the empathy culture are in a tug of war of who will get power. What happens in a tug of war is in your mind you think, I'm going to pull them to my side, and that'll mean I'm victorious, right? And so if you are in your marriage relationship or in the culture at large, if you're struggling for power, trying to pull them over through force, what you'll get is not if they finally acquiesced and came to my side. What happens in tug of war is somebody gets exhausted and they don't cross your side. They let go.
Yeah.
And when you let go, you fall away from each other.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay, good.
Okay, so the other side of that is, and that's the battle of the sexes.
Yeah.
That's saying who will be in charge of this family,
That's right.
who will be in charge of this culture.
And it's pulling masculine is pulling feminine to be more like itself. Feminine is pulling masculine to be more like itself.
And not only that, the people who don't want the fight, what they're doing is saying, well, if only the men were more like women. If only women were more like men. And now you've lost, you're like mixing it all, and that doesn't get you a solution either.
Yeah, no.
So the other side of it, in a rugby scrum, you've got the muck in the middle that no one wants to get into, but instead of pulling away from the muddy middle, they are right in it. They're pushing each other. And what happens when you push each other is that when one gets exhausted, they fall together in this, what I describe as a painful embrace, right? That in this struggle, you find each other. But you didn't have to become the other person. You didn't have to dominate or overpower the other person or manipulate. You are pushing, the way I would describe that in marriage is to say, I'm pushing you to be exactly who you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
You're pushing me to be more of who I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
And in the push, even if we're jostling, even if there's conflict, no, you need to be on that side. No, I need to be on this side.
Yeah.
You're embracing in the end.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good analogy, and the point of it is the direction, right?
That's right.
Is away, and so when there's trouble, you fall further away. When you push towards, when there's trouble, you fall towards, and you begin to continue to honor.
Yeah. So I see that in teaching in the sense, I've seen it in churches where you'll have men saying, not to women, but to everyone generally, like feelings are can't be trusted, put them away. And in doing so, I think there's an impulse among some men when they fall into that domination that the curse of Adam and Eve describes. They're pushing women to say, just be like us. If you were just like men, that'd be fine. And then what I see in our culture on the other side, growing up watching too much TV and trying to figure women out as a middle schooler, watching Oprah say, well, if men were just more like women, right?
Yeah.
And you see a lot of men, a lot of kind and Christian leaders included, saying, well, I think they're right. I think we just need to focus on compassion and focus on hospitality. If only men were more like women, well, then society would be right.
Yeah.
But it's just saying, let's go to their side. It doesn't solve the tension.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in fact, I think that what's so ironic and sad is the current form that feminism has taken as a movement has actually been destructive to femininity and women. There are study after study.
And in the same way,
Increasingly
that people like Andrew Tate are destructive to men.
Yes.
Right. And both of them are
right.
harming themselves while pointing out painful truths to the other side.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So of a woman who's, bound up into the lies of feminism.
Because I think the Andrew Tate one is he's not recognizing a problem with distorted masculinity. And he's holding up the distortion as saying that's the true one.
Yeah.
And in doing so, he's saying some true things.
Correct. Yeah.
I think the one with women is, no, you need to not be that. You need to be like this. And therefore, then you will have what you were always longing for. And that's a lie. Mm-hmm. And they lose more than they gain.
Yeah.
I want to talk about this a little more. Throw in a Packer statement, J.I. Packer. Because you talked about becoming like each other and that not being good. That's true. I agree with that. He also made this statement. He goes, as men mature, because God is, in one sense, neither male nor female, The reason he represents himself as male is another set of things. But all femininity and all masculinity come from God. So he has everything that we think of when we think of woman, and everything that we think of when we think of man.
Yeah.
In their good senses. So in that sense, he is beyond male and female. But so what he's saying then is that when men become older, they actually grow increasingly more like God as they are maturing. And they do have more feminine aspects to them because they're becoming...
Because their testosterone level drops off in age.
And then there's those aspects, but even in their maturity. And he goes, you look at men, when they get older, they do become often more sensitive individuals.
Sure.
And he goes, when you look at older women, often they become very feisty women.
Yeah.
And his point in that was that I think in some senses, as we mature, we are going and become more God-like. We're going to exhibit a wide range. We're going to exhibit more fully masculinity, but those things that are in God that are feminine, we're going to appreciate and value more. And they are going to find a reflection even in a man's life. And the same with a woman. And I thought that was a good point.
I don't know. I'm undecided on that.
Yeah, I can see that.
I can see in the stories of the older men I've known, I'm thinking of my grandfathers, that tenderness was really in a godly way, a pursuit of God that they didn't have as young men.
Yeah.
And so in that way, I agree.
And you see it in women. Get in a church fight, the older women...
Well,
I don't mean just about carpet, but I mean something substantial.
Yeah, that sense of I need to avoid conflict because it might not be safe is fading.
That's right.
Yeah. But and maybe that is a balance. I don't know. I don't need to ponder that one.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are past time. What we didn't get to talk about is whether in the future, maybe we can talk about this next time, Chat GPT and other forms of AI will be writing sermons like they write high school term papers now. So that'll be an interesting one.
It is interesting.
Okay. So with that being said,
all right,
we appreciate you guys. If you're still listening, don't forget to share this with someone who you think might need some second thoughts of their own. And until that time, we'll see you next time.